and recent months, there's a decent chance it'll be an upside surprise again, because whether people like it or not, and there's plenty of people that have good reason to be grumpy, and therefore have been hesitant to accept good news, there continue to be upside surprises. The Biden economy continues to be far better by the headline numbers that we judge every other administration by than anybody thought, right? There's the terribly aged Bloomberg headline, no offense to all my friends at Bloomberg, showing that 90% of economists, or it might have been upwards of 90% of economists, expected a recession this year. We're supposed to be in it right now. So starting simple, easy, straightforward. Heather, why are we not in a recession?
Oh.
And did you have anything to do with it?
Yeah, oh, okay. So this is my favorite question. So thank you for starting there, and thank you for I'm excited to be able to talk to you today, and I'm excited to be here with all of you. Here's the thing, when the president ran for office, we knew that there were the pandemic was raging. We knew that there were these immediate economic challenges, and yet we also knew, as I know folks here in this room know, these long-standing economic challenges, right? So you had the immediate consequences of the pandemic and all the challenges that created for families across the economy. You had the supply chain challenges where we'd really unmasked how fragile our economy was, how the lack of resiliency, on top of almost 50 years of rising economic inequality across all different kinds of axes, including long-standing racial gaps and ethnic gaps across the country that had not been closed. Mm-hmm. And then you add on top of that the consequences of climate change that are becoming more apparent each and every day. So the focus was to come up with a plan where we could deal with the immediate crisis, but the president kept saying, he said this on the campaign, the transition, the first year of governing, it wasn't enough to just deal with the consequences of an economic downturn, not just to build back from the pandemic. We had to build back better because where we were pre-pandemic just wasn't good enough. And that's, I think, the focus of why we're all here today. How do you deal with the long-term structural challenges in the economy while also dealing with the immediate? And I think this really confounded the forecasters and the pundits, because once the president got through Congress, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, also a bipartisan piece of legislation, and the Inflation Reduction Act, on top of the American Rescue Plan, we had not only put in place money and resources and programs to deal with the immediate crisis, but then also a set of policies to lay the foundation for strong, stable, sustained long-term growth. And that 1-2 punch, I think, is why we continue to see good jobs numbers. We have seen investment in this country in the construction of manufacturing facilities that has literally been off the charts, right? It has been more than double its historic, where it was pre-pandemic. So you look at this chart and it's just like, a huge shift up. We have seen that jobs have been steadier because we are making these investments around the country. Janet Yellen calls this a modern supply-side economics, and that is a term that I think really analytically resonates with, I know, what we're here to talk about today at this conference, and is why I think we have been seeing a more sustained recovery than pundits thought a year ago. They said, when the American Rescue Plan was being debated, they said it would take us 4 years to get the unemployment rate back down. We've now seen 20 months, and we'll find out new data tomorrow morning, but 20 months of an unemployment rate below 4%, that is a record that has not been achieved previously in my lifetime. That is historic, and maybe we won't beat expectations tomorrow with the jobs numbers. But 1 month is not the trend. What we are seeing is this sustained job creation machine that is out there, that the economy is creating, and we're seeing these robust investments all across the country that are coming into play that are going to benefit people, communities, families for years to come.
Yeah. There's two things there that I'm thinking of. One, I totally agree that at some point I'm going to be looking forward to working on more and more structural stories and not arguing in the paper and on Twitter with people about what 3-month seasonally adjusted core PCE inflation means for blank, bonds, I don't know. So I too am looking forward to an economic environment and a political and economic discourse that could allow us to broaden out to what this means for the next 5 years, 10 years, for our children and our children's children. To keep up the drumbeat of positive news before I then immediately rain on the parade, the productivity number that came out today was 4.7%. We got a GDP number for the past quarter of 5%, as inflation in that same quarter came down to 2.4%. I had to write some of this down because it gets a little bit complex. So your point, you mentioned unemployment, also checkable deposits. That's everything in your checking, your savings, your money market that you're earning a little bit of interest on. That was at $980 billion in 2019, at the end of 2019. Now, that's $4 trillion. So with all the struggles that the country has had, I think it's fair to say, and it's not biased to say that there has been a remarkable improvement in the aggregate in terms of American households and the American worker. But, and this is what you all are dealing with, and this is why the president seems to still be deeply underwater in terms of economic approval ratings. I find myself wrestling with weird things like percent change that actually get to some things that are deeper about how people are still struggling. For example, I'm from Louisiana, as is Mitchell Andrew, who will be here later, and there are plenty of workers where I'm from that are subject to the federal minimum wage. Now, there's a tight labor market, in part thanks to y'all's policies, and so oftentimes those folks are making $10 an hour, and also through their hard work. Those same people have now often been able to scoot up to $13 an hour, which when you see that on a chart, we have all of our friends that share all of their charts. I mean, that's a hockey stick. But then at the same time, that 30% wage gain for a lower income worker on a chart is, we should never sniff at a boost from $10 an hour to $13 an hour, right? That's the difference between somebody being able to get their kid, new school shoes or a backpack, or to take them for an ice cream, to be able to not worry about a light bill. But it doesn't shoot them into the middle class. And so that brings me towards a lot of what you were the point person on for the administration, which is childcare, role of women in the workforce, how to not just rely on the immediate stimulus that sort of gave us escape velocity from COVID, but building out a sustainable way for families to, sort of build an economic basis of economic security for themselves. So, floor is yours. Break down for the people, for everybody gathered here, what that thesis is for longer-term sustained growth for workers.
Yeah, so I think it starts from the recognition that the vast majority of us here in this country get the vast majority of our income from holding down a job. And so there's a couple of really important economic ideas that flow from that. One is that what we make and build in this country, what kinds of jobs there are, is of enormous importance. And we like to say in the Biden administration that what we make in America and how we make it really matters, right? Because that's how you're creating the industries that are creating those jobs.
Right.
But then you need to make sure that it's not just any job, but those are quality jobs, and that families and communities and workers have the things that they need to be able to succeed in the labor market. And childcare is a perfect example. And of course, we all know that a lot of things, the last Congress was an historic Congress. It got so much across the finish line. We have made game-changing investments in putting our economy on a different pathway, and doing so much to really reconfigure power relations in this country in really deep and profound and important ways in how we're making these investments. But the president's agenda around care, the care infrastructure, from childcare, home care, pre-K, as well as paid leave, they passed the House when we thought it was going to pass the Senate, but it did not make it across the finish line. And although those pieces remained in the president's budget last year, and then we put together an historic executive order around the care economy, so a lot has been done. There's still a ways to go. I'll note that one of the things that we've learned is that in the American Rescue Plan, there were historic investments in childcare around the country. Money that went out to suppliers of childcare everywhere, all across the country, so that they could keep their doors open. And one of the things that we know about this industry is that there really isn't a business model that makes sense for the vast majority of care providers, right? I dare anyone to go out, get their Excel open and put together a business plan for a childcare or home care business that provides a quality service at a price point that the majority of families in your community can afford. And unless you are living in the richest county in America, you can't do it.
And then does the caretaker actually make enough of a living wage?
Yeah. I mean, the majority of care businesses in America, both home care and child care, are sole providers, one worker, and that worker, that owner, is bringing home less than $20,000 a year. So we have this in an issue brief that, these are numbers that were in an issue brief we released about a year and a half ago at the Council of Economic Advisors. What that means is that you have to provide support on the supply side to those businesses so they can pay the care workers what they need, what they deserve, what those clients deserve, and that the clients, the customers, the kids, the aged, the disabled that need these services can pay with what they can rather than having to pay the full actual social cost. At any rate, through the American Rescue Plan, we put out so much money, and what we've seen is that led to care businesses being able to pay their workers more, being able to lower the cost for families, and yet that money's run out. And so it was really important in the supplemental. The president put in place additional funding for child care businesses, but this is going to be a continuing challenge in the economy. But it comes down to, the way that we are thinking about the economy is different, right? So let me just a quick on Bidenomics before I hand, right? Bidenomics is about making investments across the country that we need to make, people and families and communities and in industries, making sure that we're empowering and educating workers, and that we're shaping markets to be fair and competitive. 3 pillars that sit on a foundation of taxing wealth and not work. The core to that is really making sure that we're thinking about what kinds of industries we need here in this country, what is absolutely mission critical, and what does government need to be doing to be supporting those industries, and making sure that we're doing so in a way that is empowering and educating workers and shaping those markets to be fair and competitive. Care industry is a very important one, as is new technologies, semiconductors, we can talk about that till the cows come home, and clean energy, right? These are where the United States needs to be making investments to be competitive, to serve communities, and where we've been really focusing a lot of our energy.
Yeah, so I want to turn to some of the weird but super important intersections between the government providing a fiscal impulse or a government backstop to sort of not crowd out but crowd in, and how that plays in terms of how much demand is there for certain green programs in private markets and things like that. But to just roll back very quickly to what you mentioned about the uphill battle to get the care infrastructure included within the administration's push in the first half of the first term. I don't want to sound flippant, but there was this really odd energy that I felt in the country, just even reporting with normal people, but especially with wonks, where it was like, well, cutting child poverty in half is pretty nice, but on the other hand, burritos are now $17. And it's like, $18 margaritas at the bar, children, expenses. Okay, let's cut. And then we literally decide. I know that the politics of it was that there were certain senators that couldn't get behind it. Some people, fewer people in the House that were a little bit hesitant because we were at that sort of peak of inflation. But there's this idea of revealed preference that I think stood out there. And my job isn't to necessarily offer a prescription to people in terms of why they should suck it up and not marginally be able to decrease aggregate demand by taking it from kids in order to bring down some price pressure. In the same way, you are within a year going to have to, with your colleagues, face the public, and you can offer all the prescriptions you want, but ultimately they will judge you by how they feel about the economy, about society. And so how do you square that circle? How do you make the case to people that, yes, the government can spend, and that's not necessarily bad and not necessarily inflationary, and here's how you can trust that the dollars will be effective, achieve their goal, and that, there won't be money, quote unquote, sloshing around needlessly as a result. Because I think there's still that scarring, that fear that people have.
Yeah, so here's the thing. What we've learned over this administration, it's a really important lesson. We have learned that the kind of recovery that we have from a recession is a choice.
Right.
And we can choose to have a recovery that leaves long-term scars on people and families and to businesses due to high unemployment.
Yeah.
Or we can choose to take the steps we need to get people back to work. On inflation, there were so many things going on. So let me just attack that head on.
Yep.
Which is that global pandemic, fragile supply chains that businesses had been creating with the support of policy for decades that left the United States and the world vulnerable in our hour of need. For example, the global supply chain, the global shortage in semiconductors affected by one study, 169 different industries in the United States were affected by the fact that they couldn't get semiconductors. It's 169 industries where they couldn't produce the thing that they needed, that they wanted to sell, that people wanted to buy.
Right.
That filters through your entire economy. The supply chain challenges, a large part of why we saw cost increases, not just in the United States, but globally. Of course, then second, you had Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, which upended global energy prices, food prices.
Commodities.
Yeah, commodities in ways that are still reverberating. Now, we've gotten the supply chain challenges. For the large part, they've come back down. Supply chains are working as they were the levels pre-pandemic, but there's still a long ways to go, right? We need to make sure that our supply chains are resilient, and I'm going to come back to this in a second. That requires thinking a little differently about what an efficient market is, right? Because if the market's efficient at all points until it actually isn't, and then it's enormously costly because it's not resilient, those are costs that need to be internalized into the production process. They have to be, somebody has to pay for those, and for too long, nobody paid except for the consumer, right? Because that's what we saw during the pandemic. So those are two reasons that prices went up. But here's the thing, and my friends over at the Treasury Department have been doing an amazing set of reports, and one of them that just came out last week is on how much better our recovery in the United States is relative to other advanced economies. So we made decisions about bold policy choices about how to deal with the recession and the pandemic. We wanted to get kids back in school, get things back on track, make sure that people had the money that they needed to get through the pandemic, make sure small businesses had the resources they needed. Yes, we saw inflation, there were a bunch of causes, and then we weren't the only folks to see inflation.
Right.
Everyone saw inflation. And if you look at the charts, we were a little bit out ahead of the pack at the very beginning, but we were soon superseded by prices in other advanced economies. We have come back down in the United States faster than our economic competitors in other advanced economies, and our economic growth has been faster, and our unemployment rate has come down more sharply. So economists like to say there's trade-offs.
Right.
But what this president and what we have been focused on is, again, the vast majority of us get the vast majority of our income from holding down a job. The most important thing is to get the economy back to a very low unemployment rate where most people who want a job can find one, where it's frictional unemployment rather than people being stuck. And the other thing that you touched on, you talked about being from Louisiana, and I want to just note that one of the important things that we've seen over this recovery is that it has disproportionately benefited lower waged workers, right? And that's really important. We are seeing overall workers' wages are higher than the pace of inflation now, but it has been the case over especially the early part of this recovery, that workers at the lower end saw the strongest wage gains. And now with the really strong labor movements around the country, what we've just seen with hopefully the conclusion, it'll get to contract with the UAW strike, that is having these kinds of things, this organizing that's happening for workers can really have an effect on not just those unionized workers, but across the economy. Yeah. We saw that when Toyota said, we're going to raise our wages because now our competitors' pay is going up. But what we want to see is that shifting of the labor market so that those at the bottom are getting paid their fair share. And so maybe your burrito might cost a little bit more, but we also want to see that we are devoting economic resources to pulling up those wages at the bottom end of the labor market.
That's fair. That's okay. It's her job to win the crowd anyway. So I'll give you a break on inflation here because I promise that I want to broaden out to structural things. I still don't think people have realized, again, whether you disagree with it or not, the magnitude of industrial policy that you all have put into place, not just in terms of the billion-dollar or trillion-dollar amounts, but the change in thesis. I think whether you were coming at things from a market participant side of things, Wall Street or otherwise, or whether you're coming to things as a, let's say, environmentalist, there was this idea that between carrots and sticks, for things to change, or at least in terms of preferences for behavioral change, well, you're going to make market actors change their behavior with sticks, taxes, regulation, et cetera, et cetera. You all have leaned, depending on the situation, into sticks, but in a way that is completely unprecedented, not just in the United States, but around the world. You all also elected to give a big old basket of sticks to anybody that might like them in terms of green energy, clean energy, and sort of building out, I know you all don't call it a Green New Deal, but sort of pushing a green transition that can help sustainability for this one planet that we have to live on until Elon brings us to Mars or something. And so to round this into a more pointed question that I think you could help me with, because I'm actually working on some reporting that has to deal with this, like how... How are you going to know, and when should we expect that it's a fair time to start grading, how the IRA is doing, how CHIPS is doing? Because we all know that it's going to take some time, but whether it's political or whether it's just on the merits, there will be a time where we have to ask, like, okay, is permitting reform or the lack of it getting in the way? Is the blue state commitment to just keep zoning so restrictive getting in the way? So take that two-pronged question however you like. When should we start grading you all, and what do you fear are the obstacles that could get in the way of this industrial policy?
You can start grading us right now, because I think that, we're in a democracy. I work for an elected official, and we are now serving the public, and we're doing everything we can to help people understand the changes that the president is trying to make in the economy. If you go to invest.gov, what we have been putting up, my colleagues have been working so hard on, is showing the magnitude of the private investment and the public investment through the bipartisan infrastructure law. But I want to focus on the private investments because that's sort of where your question gets at. But the private investments that between the bipartisan infrastructure law, CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, all of this was focused on having those public investments in all the foundational things you need, broadband and bridges and roads and electric vehicle charging stations, all the things that you need to kind of provide that foundation, and then to crowd in private capital into the sectors that are most important for our economy to succeed, most important for economic security and national security for today and looking forward. So clearly, semiconductors is really important. We have to be on the cutting edge of that technology. It's important for national security. But I want to focus in on the clean energy pieces because when I took the job in the Biden administration, on my very first, the very first sentence I said was that I'll only take this if you let me have the climate portfolio. Because as a labor economist, as somebody who's been focused on what is good for workers and families, if we don't win on thinking about how we're going to invest in clean energy, we are not going to be able to create the jobs that families are going to need in the coming decades. And I want to give credit to the folks that did so much organizing in the years before, over the preceding years, to all the folks on the Green New Deal that, really elevated the intersection between the kind of economy that we're creating and how the only path to address climate change, unless you're going to tell all the humans to just stop using energy, right? Unless we're going to do that, which seems really tough, the only path is to create these clean energy industries. And we have to do that in a way that brings workers, families, and communities and industry along. So, okay, if you start from there, then you're like, okay, well, how are we going to bring industry along? Actually, it's really expensive to retool a factory from producing an internal combustion engine vehicle to producing a clean vehicle. You got to create all new things. It's going to cost a lot of money. And somebody has to pay for that, and we don't have time to wait for markets to just work their magic over 40 or 50 years. We waited too long for that, even if that would have ever worked, different session. But making sure that you're saying, we're going to support you, but you know what? When we do so, when we use taxpayer dollars to invest in clean energy, you need to do it in a way that's going to benefit people in this country, and while also working with our friends and allies, but it needs to benefit communities. We can't have, let me start that sentence over. We've learned in decades past what it means to undergo a structural shift in the economy and not think about how that's going to affect workers and communities. Economists, a decade and a half later, started writing about the China shock. How once we opened up trade with China, that led to devastation in some communities around the country that those communities have still not recovered from in terms of employment and earnings. We can't allow that to happen as we as a fossil fuel exporter transition, build a new clean energy economy. And so the president's plans have said, you got to do this with prevailing wages. You have to make sure that you are investing in low-income communities. You have to make sure that you're investing in fossil fuel communities. So not demanding, but in creating incentives. We'll give you a bunch of money, and we'll give you even more money if you put that investment in a lower-income community, right? And we'll give you a lot of money, but if you do it the right way, we'll give you even more. You'll get more of a credit if you use prevailing wages. Right. And so you can judge us now. Get on invest.gov. You will see this map of over 600 billion private sector investments. We're not going to make it through clean energy if we do not have the private sector. They're the ones with all the money. Newsflash, right? We live in one of the richest countries the world has ever seen. They've got a lot of dough, but they need to direct it towards this, and that's what we're seeing. But 615 some odd billion dollars in private sector investment, and another report from my colleagues over at Treasury, that investment is disproportionately going to the communities that need it the most. And this, for me, I have so many moments of pride serving this administration. My president walked on a picket line. We have the strongest, right? We've had the best recovery in terms of job creation in my lifetime. Very proud. But this map, what we've seen, that these investments are going into low-income communities that where people disproportionately don't have bachelor's degrees, the communities that need it most. Many of these communities didn't vote for the president, but you know what? We don't care, right? This president is serving all of America, and if we want to fix inequality, if we want to make sure that everyone benefits, that's what we need to do. And the path this isn't going to be easy. Building a factory is not done overnight, right? But making those investments, bringing communities along, that's what we're focused on. And it is really hard work. And my colleagues, back at the White House right now, are all working so hard to make sure that we are implementing all those things and getting it right. And, not everything is going to be perfect, right? There's going to be some bumps along the way, but you can see that direction is moving in the right direction. And it's thanks to so many, people like you that pushed for the kinds of policies that are going to benefit people, that are going to be inclusive, and that are going to make sure that we address these longstanding inequities and put us on a sustainable path.
Eloquently put, yeah. I guess in closing, rather than try to argue with these numbers that you seem to know very well,
it's my job.
It's absolutely true that every time you all throughout the past 2 years and some change have come out with a new policy, there's been debate about it, whether it's implementation, structure, but quite often we have to say the words unprecedented this, unprecedented blank, because it's certainly a bold approach. It's not in many ways the approach that the last Democratic administration, who you have many friends in, took. And so one thing that I think will be very interesting, back to the idea of grading, is that when I think of the arguments that are made against the approach that this Council of Economic Advisors and that the White House and the sort of consolidated team have taken, is that it essentially adds up to, I was talking with a friend about this last night, well, if you do this, the sky's gonna fall. You know, and you fill in the blank with what the sky falling means, recession, you know, a budget crisis, whatever, more inflation, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, to your credit, we will now have a few years, an election, and then afterwards decades to see what the already sort of built-in economic framework that you have put in place does. And if the sky doesn't fall, then I think in a very interesting way, we might have to change some of our priors. So I will just leave it at that. Ladies and gentlemen, Heather Boushey.
Thank you.